first of all, the thing was when you're in war, you lose your entire childhood almost. It's sort of like it just jump starts itself. I mean, you're now thinking about food, you're now thinking about survival, things that children would usually not think about. I mean, it's just supposed to be there. And so that entire childhood essentially has gone away. And so when we, at the camp at that point, I had made this commitment that if I survived the camp, I'll give my life to working for peace, working to help children, making sure that no child lived in that situation. I had no idea how I would do it. It was just this sort of promise that I had made. And so when we got back, I mean, the first thing we were doing was just community cleanup campaign. I mean, getting my friends together, let's clean up the community. We've been away for several months. There's bullets all over. There's, bodies all over. Let the young people do that, essentially. So that had been our first project. And then we went from there, starting to think on a larger scale, what can we do? I mean, maybe we can save everybody. And there was this sense that children can make a change, essentially. And we had the idea of let's write to the UN and ask for money. Of course, the UN at that point was into giving money to a 14-year-old who had, written a letter, asking for money. And so it took 2 years of us struggling through this, just keeping the organization alive by doing small protest demonstrations, school presentations, stuff like that. And then eventually, in 2 years, they did approve our first proposal for funding to fund something called the Children's Disarmament Campaign, because the idea was, even if we can't end the war, we can at least disarm the children who are fighting, because at this point we're in the capital, we've got some safety, there's UN peacekeepers. Everybody else around the country, there's still 20,000 child soldiers fighting, there's still war everywhere else. And we essentially said to ourselves, we can't continue to be living in peace where there's thousands of children languishing in armed forces. And so that was the first project that got funded. And the idea behind that project was we're going to go to the rebel forces and the rebel leaders and convince them to call for a disarmament of all their child soldiers.
And did you actually do that?
Yes, we did do this. We did do this in '96.
What was the result?
Oh, it was scary. I mean, because of course, when we wrote the proposal, there was this sense of, well, they're going to reject it. They've rejected numerous proposals. And then once they approved, it was like, oh wow, okay. Oh, that means we actually have to go outside the capital to meet these rebel leaders. So of course, right there's this sense of fear of what's going to happen, knowing that these guys killed without discretion, and there was no sense of, oh, they're children, we're not going to kill them. They had children fighting in their armies. So, but we were going to different, sometimes we were meeting with their captains, sometimes we were meeting with different commanders, sometimes we were meeting, the children's units were called the small boy units, because they were all children. So we're meeting the commanders of the small boy units, and essentially what we're doing, there was a group of 3 young people traveling with me, and all we were saying was that we're coming to you, we're telling you what children are going through. I mean, we weren't doing any negotiations, we weren't doing any, I had no sense of peace or conflict resolution skills. It was just talking to them, presenting what we had gone through, presenting what children were going through in the armies. And miraculously, I mean, the idea was to get them to sign a petition saying that at the end of that year, at the end of '96, all the children fighting for them would disarm. They were also recording their voices saying that children fighting for them should lay down their arms, because we knew that there had been 17 or so peace accords that had gone through, that these guys had gone to, signed it, and right after they got back from the peace meeting started fighting. So now we're asking them, not just sign the petition, record your voice as well. Again, the power of media. And then that recording was going back to the radio stations that were playing it. So the child soldiers were listening. They were hearing their commander's voices saying, by December 31st, you can turn over your guns to peacekeepers. So it was just this massive movement, and they were all signing the petition, essentially, and recording their voices. And that process started, and I think that year, right after we had done our movement, they had done another peace meeting where there was this sense of not just disarming the children, but let's disarm everybody by June '97, and so disarmament began that year. And by the following year in June, there was total disarmament, and elections was held, I think, in July for a new president. So, I mean, essentially what had happened was the Voice of the Future was the overarching organization. We were doing work on spreading messages of peace and reconciliation. The Children's Disarmament Campaign was sort of like just a campaign out of that organization, connected to that organization. And it would only be until, I think right after Voice of the Future, we started another organization. That was the only other separate organization, called the Children's Bureau of Information. And that was again we're funded by a group called Search for Common Ground, a US-based, a DC-based group. And that was essentially saying, okay, now disarmament has been achieved. How do we reintegrate the child soldiers back into the community? How do we sensitize the community to that? Because, I mean, some of the children had been forced to kill their own families. They had committed atrocities to their best friends, to their communities. And now they're coming back. They're older. They're not the cute kids anymore. Everybody sees them as the devil, as they were called. And so what we're doing is, okay, now we've done the disarmament part. How do we do the reintegration? And the Children's Bureau of Information was doing these programs, airing programs using the media again, where we're recording programs done exclusively, produced by children. The children announced, they were all children announcers, and they were being aired on all the radio stations, and it was called the Golden Kids News, which was essentially trying to build community with returning child soldiers. Now what's going to happen essentially in Liberia, Voice of the Future is now being spinned off by Youth Action International. Youth Action being the organization that I started in the US. We're now opening offices in Liberia and Sierra Leone. So essentially it's the Voice of the Future staff that's now coming in under the umbrella of Youth Action International, just so it builds up as an international agency. After the war, after going through 7 years of this brutal war, you didn't have people demanding psychiatrists or Prozac, or, you know, it was sort of like you didn't have people jumping off the roofs everywhere despite the trauma. There was still this entire population of people who were saying, well, it's not tremendously better, but hey, I'm still alive. I can eat today, there's rice tomorrow. Where are the jobs? I want the jobs, because then people started asking for jobs, essentially. I mean, there was this sense where the UN had come in. I mean, there was a point where we had no food. Then they started bringing in food, and then food was just going on. It was like food, 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 and people were like, well, we don't just want to continue standing on relief lines. We want to be able to work. We're used to being able to feed our family, and that message never sinked in. And there's always this sense of Africans are just sitting around waiting for food, which is totally, totally untrue. And so that had changed. I mean, the new person who had come into power, Charles Taylor, was the guy who had started the war and had won the elections by, I think, 51% of the votes. And essentially most people had voted for him because there was this sense of, if I don't vote for him, he's going to start the war again. And so immediately after he came to power, my organization was now established. We had the national recognition because of the work we had done. There was this sense that, you know, the UN now respected our work. They were funding our programs. There was this sense of children can play a part in a national peace process. And so we started now working with his government on education, on health care, trying to get the government to jumpstart those things. And everything was well and peachy. We were meeting him on a fairly regular basis until '98, when his government started training 500 children. This time it's not in the bushes, this time it's not out of sight, it's right in the capital, it's on the national training base. Made no sense, didn't believe it until I finally went there to check it out. And, you know, indeed seeing children who had sticks on their backs were doing military drills and training, and completely shocked me at that point. And that's when from there we started talking, trying to get the government to disarm. They started, you know, his government started threatening, we'll make you disappear. I mean, at Liberia at this point, all the people who had ran against child still had either been forced into exile or killed or something like that. And so we started talking, there were threats starting to come. I still went ahead and called a press conference and issued the report around my findings, essentially. And that was what sparked the government manhunt for me, because essentially pissed the entire government off. And they said, you know, Kimmie Weeks is going too far. You know, you had government ministers calling me a dangerous subversive. I was a threat to the Constitution. This was 98. I was 17. So there was this sense that, you know, he's trying to overthrow the government, and then immediately after that, the soldiers and the police were coming out to find me, essentially. So my officers had soldiers deployed. I mean, the first time they came out looking for me, actually, because I was 17 is why they didn't have a sense of who I was, because, you know, with all the, you know, emergency cabinet meetings have been called and stuff like that. So the soldiers who had said, go find Kimmie Weeks, essentially had this feeling it's got to be like a 50, 60-year-old dude. I mean, the government's going in like, you know, going crazy. And so the first day they were looking, I mean, I was in my office when they had come in. I was standing right at the front desk when the soldiers had come in and said, we're looking for Kimmie Weeks. And of course, they said, oh, no, never heard of him, never seen him. You know, he's not around here. The guy resigned a long time ago. And they left. So that was essentially, and then right there we knew what was happening. And then they deployed men at my home. My school was shut down for several days with soldiers deployed there.
You went underground?
Went underground, essentially. I was switching homes every 2 days at different friends' house. So it was just this intense week of new fear, because there was this sense of I'm completely trapped in Liberia, you know, with the government on my back. A foreign embassy had essentially come and said, called me in for a meeting and said, we want to help you leave Liberia, because we realize you're in this, you know, extreme circumstance, and, you know, there's nothing you can essentially do. And so I had gone out with a group of traditional dancers, essentially, and we were supposed to be on this trip through the rural areas on a performance tour. And of course, if the government had stopped the car and said, come perform for us, I wouldn't be sitting here either, because I would have known nothing. And so we went to the rural areas, crossed into Ivory Coast, and then I went to Abidjan, and then the capital of the Ivory Coast, and then came to the States 6 months later under political asylum, and I've been here ever since. What's essentially happening was Charles Stiller was still in power. Mm-hmm. So as long as he was the president, I couldn't fly back, you know, waving and saying, you know, I'm back. So essentially what happened was in '94, he was forced out of power. The U.S. government had given him a 72-hour ultimatum to leave. He had taken exile in Nigeria, so almost the day after he left, I started planning my trip, and then was back in Liberia in January 2005.